Sometimes you hear a proposal that sounds like a simple real estate deal on the surface, but when you dig in, it's actually a massive geopolitical power play. And that's exactly what we're digging into today. It's a pretty fascinating and, let's be honest, a really provocative statement about national interest on the world stage. And boom, here's the statement that really sets the stage for everything we're about to talk about. I mean, it's so unambiguous, so forceful, and it immediately makes you ask two things, right? First, why Greenland of all places? And second, why come at it with this incredibly direct, almost blunt approach? All right, so what's the thinking here? What's the logic behind a statement that bold? Well, it turns out it's not really about resources or, old school expansion. The entire argument, the whole foundation, is built on a perceived threat, a threat from two very specific global rivals. Yeah, the entire justification really boils down to one key idea: preemption. The argument is pretty simple when you lay it out. If the US doesn't establish control over Greenland, then Russia or China will. And just like that, this whole thing gets reframed. It's not just an acquisition anymore. It's a strategic necessity. And look, this threat isn't just some vague, far-off idea. The speaker is pointing to very specific military hardware. We're talking destroyers, submarines, from these rival powers that are supposedly operating in the area right now. This is the evidence that's being presented to say, hey, the region is already a stage for some serious military posturing. And this quote, man, this really gets to the bottom line of the whole argument. It's basically a declaration of a sphere of influence. The goal isn't just about being in Greenland, it's about making absolutely sure that Russia and China are kept out, that they can't establish a strategic foothold there, period. Okay, but hold on a second. You might be thinking, the US already has a military presence there, right? At Thule Air Base. So why isn't just expanding that enough? Well, the answer to that question reveals a pretty deep-seated belief about what it really truly means to control a piece of territory. And that really is the central question here, isn't it? It's the big challenge to this whole idea. It forces us to take a deeper look at the philosophy that's driving this. And the answer, well, it reveals a huge difference between just having temporary access and actually commanding permanent sovereignty. Okay, think about it like this. You defend a house you own way differently than a house you're just renting, right? That's the core idea here. From this point of view, leases are temporary. They're kind of weak. The Iran deal was even brought up as a horrible example of a short-term agreement that just doesn't have any real teeth. Ownership, though, that's seen as a permanent commitment, something a nation will defend with everything it's got. And there you have it. That's the core belief in a nutshell. Only total ownership can guarantee total defense. You see, according to this way of thinking, a lease is just, well, it's a temporary arrangement. But ownership, that becomes a national imperative. It completely changes the entire strategic calculation. Okay, so we've got the what, getting Greenland, and the why, to block Russia and China. But what about the how? How would this whole transfer of sovereignty actually go down? The approach that was laid out was, well, let's just say it was very direct. So basically, two paths were put on the table. First up, you have the nice way, a negotiated deal. But right after that, we hear about the hard way, which pretty much implies that a deal isn't even required. What this does is it frames the whole acquisition not as a maybe, not as a possibility, but as an inevitability. This phrase right here, it's basically an ultimatum that's dressed up to look like a choice. It's like saying, hey, we'd prefer to cooperate, but making it crystal clear that cooperation is not a requirement to get to the finish line. Of course, a move this big doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It directly involves Denmark, a key NATO ally, and it's explicitly aimed at two major global competitors. So the question is, how does all this fit into the bigger picture of international relations? So what about Denmark? The country that's actually governed Greenland for centuries? Well, the position on them is made very, very clear. That historical claim is directly challenged and basically pushed aside in favor of what are seen as modern strategic needs. And this is the exact quote used to justify that challenge. It just completely dismisses that long-standing historical claim as irrelevant when you look at today's geopolitical realities. It's a total reframing of sovereignty, away from being about history and towards being about present-day power and purpose. And what's really fascinating here is how this is all put into context. The speaker says they're a big fan of Denmark, while at the same time challenging its sovereignty. They mention getting along great with Presidents Putin and Xi, but then follow that up with warnings. And the whole thing gets wrapped up in this assertion that these actions are actually for the good of NATO, an alliance the speaker claims to have saved. And so all of this leaves us with a pretty powerful question to think about. When does the language of business, buying an asset, cross the line and become a fundamental reordering of the world map? It really forces you to think, where does a real estate deal end and a global security crisis begin?